All right, let's dive right in. To really understand this, we're going to have to start by just completely throwing out the old playbook on what it means to be above average. When we hear that phrase, our minds usually jump straight to those highly visible markers of success, right? Massive bank accounts, perfect test scores, maybe some incredibly impressive career titles. But in this explainer, we are looking at something far more profound. We're going to explore the concept of the mind's invisible architecture, because psychology actually tells us that being above average isn't primarily about the stuff you've accomplished. It's really about how deeply you've developed internal patterns that, frankly, most people just never build. We're talking about those quiet choices made when comfort is the far easier option, the entirely private decisions happening just beneath the surface.
So think about this. Why do certain conversations just leave you feeling completely empty? If you've ever had this quiet, nagging suspicion that you operate on a totally different frequency than the people around you, well, let me tell you, you are absolutely not alone. Have you ever wondered why certain environments make you want to literally just disappear into the background? Or why some social interactions drain you to your absolute core? For a really long time, you might have actually thought this was a flaw, like something was wrong with you. But cognitive psychology and behavioral neuroscience have spent decades studying people who process the world differently. And as you'll see, this isolating feeling, it isn't a defect at all. It's actually a measurable sign of a uniquely developed mind.
Because really, there are two completely different ways of interacting with the unknown. On one hand, we have the average mind. It's driven by what psychologists call the need for cognitive closure. For this mind, uncertainty is physically painful. So what does it do? It grabs the nearest available answer, seals it shut, and just moves on. But on the other hand, we have the non-average mind. And people with this kind of architecture are deeply, sometimes shockingly, comfortable with not knowing. They possess this highly developed ability to just live inside ambiguity without panicking. They'll hold a question open and turn it over from a dozen different angles. Because they have a significantly lower need for cognitive closure, they actually demonstrate way higher levels of abstract thinking, intellectual flexibility, and creative problem solving. I mean, they literally feel more alive inside a really good problem than they do inside an easy answer.
Which brings us to our first major deep dive. Section 1, the discipline of attention.
Guarding your focus is a massive part of what separates the non-average mind from the rest of the crowd. For most of the world, attention is just this thing that constantly gets pulled from one shiny object to the next. But to a highly developed mind, attention isn't just focus. It is the literal raw material of a human life. Every thought given to something that doesn't matter is a thought stolen from something that does. And to back this up, we can actually look at the hard science. Psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi spent 4 decades studying optimal human experience, and what he found was incredibly consistent. The people who reported the highest levels of meaning, creative achievement, and overall life satisfaction, they all shared one identical cognitive trait. They had learned to direct their attention deliberately. People who are not average understand this at a level that most people just never reach.
So, how do they actually pull this off? Well, they use this sort of internal accounting process. Imagine you've got this tiny, absolutely ruthless accountant living right up in your brain. For every engagement, every random input, every passing conversation, this accountant is essentially asking 2 questions. Number 1, what is this going to cost my mental bandwidth? And number 2, what does it actually return? They are constantly weighing the energy drain of their environment against the actual tangible value it provides. When an input is just consuming mental space without producing anything worth keeping, trust me, they notice it immediately. So the crucial takeaway here is that when you see someone just quietly close their laptop, step away from the noise, or go completely silent during a really draining conversation, that's not antisocial arrogance. It's not depression either. It is a highly necessary act of cognitive self-preservation. They are making a very clear-eyed choice to protect their thinking space because they understand exactly what their focus is worth. They have this almost inexplicable need to guard that space, which is a massive behavioral signal that they know exactly what they are building in life. And this spilled right into the absolute bedrock of this invisible architecture. Section 2, your internal locus of control.
Now, if guarding your attention is the defense, well, this is the offense. This is all about measuring your worth internally and completely, unapologetically ignoring the applause or the boos of the crowd. Think about it. If you ask an average person how they know they did a good job, the answer almost always lives entirely outside of them. They're looking for approval, validation, some kind of reaction from the world. But back in 1954, psychologist Julian Rotter formalized this radically different trait called the internal locus of control. It's the core belief that your outcomes are determined primarily by your own choices, your own effort, and your own internal standards, rather than by outside forces. Rotter found that people with a really strong internal locus of control exhibit incredibly high self-regulation, greater goal achievement, and vastly superior resilience under pressure. Basically, they don't look around the room to see if they're doing well, they look inward.
But here is where it gets heavy, and honestly, you might just recognize yourself in this. The weight of these private standards can be immense. These individuals are holding themselves to a level of quality that literally no one else would even notice if they let it slip. I mean, they are constantly revising work that only they will ever read. They are losing sleep over problems that no one else has even detected yet. These punishingly high internal benchmarks mean they often feel the weight of an unmet standard, even when, publicly, everything looks perfectly fine to everyone else. It's exactly why they can feel so profoundly misunderstood by the outside world, because the world can only see the final output, not that invisible architecture of standards they've painstakingly built in private.
Which brings us to a fascinating third layer. Section 3, transforming discomfort into data. Look, everyone encounters pain, loss, and failure. That's just life. But what separates the average from the non-average is exactly how that pain is processed. For a lot of folks, pain essentially becomes their identity. It turns into this permanent lens through which every future experience is filtered. Psychologists actually call this pain absorption. But a known average mind does something truly remarkable here. They don't retreat from the discomfort, and they definitely don't put on some fake performance of strength. They lean right into it. When pain arrives, they ask one very specific question. What did this teach me that literally nothing else could have? Neurologically speaking, they are actively using their prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for long-term thinking and emotional regulation, to metabolize that pain. They flat out refuse to let the pain write the next chapter of who they are. Instead, they transform it. They take something that happened to them and they turn it into fuel and direction that sharpens them. Discomfort literally becomes their data. Next up, we have to look at how this kind of mind interacts with time. Section 4, thinking in years. Because they rely so heavily on internal standards and metabolize their setbacks, their temporal scale, the actual timeline on which they judge their life, is dramatically altered. Psychology has a really interesting term for this: delay discounting. It's basically the human tendency to overvalue immediate emotional rewards at the expense of much larger future ones. Most people live strictly in the immediate. What do I gain today? But people who are not average, they operate way over on the far right of this timeline. They think in decades. They are slowly, deliberately building a version of themselves through patient work that is eventually going to compound. But here is the hard truth about delay discounting. Making choices for a 5-year or 10-year horizon is often going to make you look like you are falling behind in the present moment. You'll look like you're doing less simply because your work doesn't show up in the moment. It shows up across a lifetime. And that brings us to our final, and perhaps most important, realization. Section 5. Stop apologizing for difference. Because these minds process time, attention, standards, and pain so differently from the norm, they often spend a significant portion of their lives feeling this quiet, devastating loneliness. Like they just don't quite fit the mold. For a long time, you might have actually interpreted that not fitting as hard evidence that something is broken. You might have found yourself asking, what is wrong with me? But the research on psychological resilience shows us that the people who end up creating the most lasting impact make one absolutely critical internal shift. They move from asking, what is wrong with me, to asking, what is this trying to show me? They completely stop treating their difference as a defect and start recognizing it for what it is, a massive psychological advantage. They stop shrinking the way they think just to avoid making other people uncomfortable. Which leaves us with one final, incredibly important question. Are you ready to stop waiting for permission to be fully what you are? Because when you finally make that internal shift, not fitting in stops feeling like isolation, and it instantly starts feeling like direction. Your unique architecture, your unyielding internal locus of control, your fierce guarding of your attention, your amazing capacity to just live comfortably in ambiguity, that is exactly what makes you irreplaceable. So guard those internal standards and do it without an ounce of apology. Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer. I really hope it gave you the exact language you needed to finally understand the brilliant invisible architecture